Philanthropy Together is on a mission to democratize and diversify philanthropy globally in order to expand who and what gets funded. And the way we do this, we do it through storytelling, through training, research, and advocacy. So Philanthropy Together is really ushering in a new era of philanthropy that is democratic, diverse, and powered by people acting in solidarity, with a goal to scale and strengthen all models of collective giving circles, collaborative funds, fundraising circles, women's funds, and so many more models of collective giving.
Can you talk a little bit about what it means to do that work in a global context?
The concept of people banding together to create change is as old as humanity itself. Yeah. It's definitely not new, not American. It's rooted in cultures and communities across the globe. So it's really important to understand and appreciate these ways of generosity that have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. I have so many stories, but a story of why Philanthropy Together is needed. We have become in 3.5 years the spokesperson of the spokes is the entity for collective giving. We were really putting collective giving on the spotlight. A lot of people tell us like, oh my God, what you're doing is really innovative. And we said, no, it's not innovative. We're going back to the roots of generosity, of humanity. We're just putting a spotlight on it.
I felt that myself. It's so true that these fundamental principles are universal. Families banding together to help a member of the family who can't afford to go to school. Or the school lunch programs here in the US were started by groups who recognized that there were students in their community who just couldn't eat. And so they banded together to provide meals, which later became an institution here. And I think that work is so fundamental to just what it means to be human. Can you explain, I think, for our audience, a little bit of the difference between some of the forms that these collective giving efforts can take? For example, giving circles versus collaborative funds.
What is the difference between a giving circle and a collaborative fund? And the reality is that they are very similar. Both models include a community of people with shared values that come together, and they pool donations to multiply the power of their gift. So giving circles most often bring together everyday donors, right, into larger communities of 50 or even more than 100 donors, and are often volunteer run and use democratic decision making. And on the other hand, collaborative funds most often bring together high net wealth donors or institutional funders to give together. And those funding decisions range from being donor-led, staff-led, or community-led. And then collaborative funds are most often their own organizational entity with its own staff and offers ongoing wraparound support to the grantees they support. So our team is particularly excited about the rise of collaborative funds with lived experience leadership at the front lines of decision making. But the beautiful nature of this way of giving is how they build on one another.
What are some of the challenges that these groups face in trying to come together to engage in collective giving and philanthropy?
Yes, you mentioned the managing of the funds. That's always the big question, especially globally. Because here in the US, especially after the pandemic, you mentioned Growth Fund. There's also Just Fund. There's also Grapevine. So there are many platforms now where giving circles and collaborative funds can manage their money. How do we handle the funds? And as you may know, some giving circles are hosted by community foundations, by faith organizations like Jewish Federation. So some giving circles are hosted by institutions. Some use these tech platforms. Some are still sending checks to organizations. But I would say that the biggest challenge that we are seeing now is, engagement, right? Mm-hmm. And have been since 2020. Why? Because there's so many competing ways for an individual to spend their time, right? Our attention span is getting shorter and shorter. And collective giving really thrives on personal connections, creating a space for in-person interaction to to really host brainstorms, meet for coffee, listen to stories, share a meal together. So that is a need that we see across the field. And now that after the pandemic, or there were in the last few months of the pandemic, we're seeing that appetite for groups to go back in person, right? To re-engage all those members that they lost a little bit during the pandemic years. And really how I feel is this competing for people's attention. I don't know if you have noticed, but everybody signs up for I don't know how many courses or trainings online. And then at the end of the day, you show up for just a fraction of everything that you signed up for. So we need to figure out how we change that. And it is very exciting to see the growth of the movement, how more diverse giving circles have been popping up, involving younger people, the LGBTQ community, diverse communities, and more importantly, the organizations that these giving circles are funding, right? A lot of times giving circles act as seed funders for grassroots nonprofits, tiny nonprofits that are invisible for traditional philanthropy. And I really think this is the sweet spot for collective giving, really go outside of the box in finding the groups that are trusted by the communities, that are community-led, and supporting those organizations. And again, I also believe that collective giving and collective giving groups are mini labs of civic engagement. And we have seen the relationship between being part of a collective giving group and being more civically engaged in your community.
It's really interesting to think about the contrast between collective giving and what often gets labeled as or tax benefited as philanthropy. And to examine that in contrast to, say, Giving USA, which comes out and says a lot of people are choosing not to give because they look at others in their community and they're saying, those rich people over there can give. And it really splits it up into an us versus them, into silos, like so many other things in our world today. And I'm just curious to dig a little deeper there into, this may be a vague question, so I apologize if it's not unclear, but I'm just curious about that, to dive a little deeper into that human experience and what makes collective giving potentially a counter to the engagement problems faced in other parts of the social impact sector or the philanthropic sector. What makes it special for the people who engage in it?
I love this question. And actually, I had the opportunity at the beginning of this year to present at the Generosity Commission in DC. And yes, we're seeing that there is this generosity crisis, less people are giving. And my response, and a lot of the people that presented that way, is that maybe we also have a little bit of an issue in how we track the ways of giving, right? Because traditionally, we're tracking the dollars that people give to established nonprofits, to 501c3s. And we are not tracking these informal ways of generosity. That is why I love what Giving Tuesday is doing with their data commons, right? And full disclosure, I sit on the board of Giving Tuesday. So I'm very moved and extremely interested in what they're doing, because generosity and philanthropy is not only about moving money. In collective giving, we talked about the 5 T's, right? You give your treasure, which is your financial contribution. You give your time, so it's your volunteer time. You give your skills or your talents. You give your ties and your testimony. And your ties and your testimony are key, because you and I are part of a lot of different networks, right? We're part of our colleagues, our family, our neighbors, and we can open incredible doors to those organizations and causes that we care about. And a lot of times those doors that we open for those organizations are going to be more impactful than the amount of money that we can donate. And then your testimony, right? Our voices. How can we elevate the work of the organizations that we care about? How can we, and it can be something as simple as signing up for the newsletters of organizations, following them on social media, talking about their work when we are with our friends and family. The way of collective giving and the first part of it, which is not solo philanthropy, it's a community of people. It's extremely important to attack what we're seeing around polarization, around isolation. Because when you are in community with others and you talk about the values that guide your individual giving and you find those common values for the group, even though you and I could be very different and have very different perspectives in a lot of things, we are going to find that unite us instead of what takes us apart. And that is an important exercise in democracy because we're going to put our individual decision in the back burner for the decision of the group. I mentioned last year in the TED Talk that in a given circle, in a collaborative fund, you always come with something to share and you always leave with something learned. And we have seen people that come from different ways of life that wouldn't never been around the same table if it wasn't because of a collective giving group. So for me, that is something that is extremely important. More people are giving to 501c4s, right? For example, there is a big network of political giving circles called the States Project. And also, I feel that it's important to mention that it depends like the level of giving. You will always have the people that do want that tax deduction and people that are altruistic. And I'm rooting for the second group a lot more. A lot of members of giving circles and collaborative funds are members from the community, right? Same community that they represent. So a lot of these power dynamics and power lines get totally blurred. And that is extremely important because you have the voices in the community in the decision-making process.
We can move philanthropy, and it really can be more effective if we think about strategically moving it beyond just a transaction. Here you go, here's a check, goodbye, to creating community, creating an ecosystem. When you think about that work, I always like to ask about urgency so that anyone listening can get a sense of why it's important to support Philanthropy Together and the work you're doing today and now rather than later. Would love to get your perspective on that.
Yes, totally. So why now? All the money in the world is not going to save us. I think beloved communities will, in this story that I told you about. So for me, the important call to action to everybody that is listening to us is join a community. Join a giving circle, join a giving project, join a women's fund, join a collaborative. Why is this important? Collaborative funds and giving circles have charted a course that differs from traditional philanthropy. They tilt towards equity and justice and field and movement building. There is more leaders of color in collaborative funds. And for a growing number, they are shifting that power to community-led decision-making. And that is how transformation of a big field like philanthropy can happen, right? Little by little. Thank you so much for having me, Brandolon. This has been a pleasure of mine.